Okay, thank you very much for such a warm welcome, Vice-Chancellor, colleagues and friends. It's an honour and privilege to be invited to share some thoughts with you on the future of public health in England. Not least because, as has already been pointed out this evening, this most auspicious day, it's the third public health white paper in recent years. I've had a hand in all three of them, actually. And the white paper's been published earlier this afternoon. More of that later. Here it is. You can get it off the web in the morning or when you go back later. Shortly after this year's general election, it was announced that there would be no more top-down reorganisations of the NHS. This news was followed almost immediately by the revelation that there was to be a massive top-down reorganisation of the NHS. It's axiomatic that to maintain your sanity in the public services, it's important to be able to hold totally contradictory policies in your head simultaneously. Most of us have lost count of the number of reorganisations since the NHS was established, but it is well over 20, and it equates to one every 2 to 3 years. Certainly the public at large, but also many health professionals, both in the service and in academia, can be forgiven if they're confused and bewildered by the arrangements currently in place. In my previous role as North West Regional Director of Public Health and Regional Medical Officer, I was heading into my 5th reorganisation in 13 years when I decided that you can have too much of a good thing, and I decided to get back down to earth and off the carousel, otherwise known as Pickford's Department of Health. In this first 6 months of the new administration, there's been a frenzy of policy making and indicated reorganisation, but this time, Secretary of State Andrew Lansley assures us that it will be different. At a recent event in Wigan, he told tired NHS managers that the latest changes will establish a robust settlement which will prevent these biennial reorganisations. From a long time ago, in a different place and point in my career, I'm blackly reminded of a patient of mine who was afflicted by a crippling form of obsessional neurosis. The effect of this on him was that he was compelled to carry out elaborately choreographed rituals, 5 paces in one direction, 12 in another, 2 backwards, and so on. Despite all our efforts with most of the medications then available, it was proving impossible to find him any relief. One day he came to see me in a state of extreme distress. He decided that he was going to deal with his rituals once and for all by rehearsing the most comprehensive, blockbuster, elaborate ritual in a secluded public space. Halfway through his carefully planned routine, he forgot what to do next. I experienced this disturbing déjà vu on reading the NHS white paper earlier this year. I came into public health in 1976 after an immersion in clinical medicine, which had included tropical medicine in Fiji, a spell in old age medicine, followed by specialist training in psychiatry and reproductive health before going into general practice. I'd found myself drifting further and further away from clinical institutions and into communities as the light dawned on me that so much time, effort and money is spent pulling people out of fast or not so fast flowing rivers rather than preventing them from falling in the first place or teaching them to swim. Archie Cochrane, the father of evidence-based medicine, tells the story in his small but influential book, Effectiveness and Efficiency, Random Reflections on the NHS, of meeting a worker from the local crematorium. The man comments to Archie that he's always amazed at how much goes in and how little comes out. Archie's response is to wonder whether he's ever thought about a job in the NHS. The moment I came into public health, I found a place where I felt at home and where I was exposed to insights into the determinants of health and well-being that linked the social history of the 19th and 20th centuries with politics, economics, the Industrial Revolution, arts, culture, living and working conditions, and the exciting British tradition of trying to influence and shape whole systems to secure the public's health. It was not for nothing that public health has been described as the political wing of medicine, or the House of Commons as the pharmacy of public health. I sat in awe in the classroom of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in Gower Street, listening as my teacher, Sidney Chave, told the story of the evolution of public health in England in the 19th century in response to the Industrial Revolution, the massive growth of the great towns such as Salford, Manchester and Liverpool, with their overwhelming slums and epidemics that threatened the viability of trade as well as that of people, and the way in which the city fathers, there were no mothers in those days, had risen to the challenge of sanitary reform and creating cities fit to live in. In so doing, they secured their own credibility as town and city councils, and from being talking shops of the landed and enfranchised few, became the vibrant providers of the wide range of services that we're familiar with today, sanctioned by the many more who had the vote after the 1832 Reform Act. And then I crashed to earth in 1976 in that classroom as I realised that 2 years earlier, in 1974, the system of public health in England, which had been established for over 100 years, from its beginnings in Liverpool in 1847, copied throughout the British Empire, had been wantonly destroyed by the outgoing administration, the same political party that's introduced the white paper today. The medical officer of health was gone, off to the NHS for 14 years as a community physician, recognisable as neither physician nor of community, while the social workers post-CBOM in 1970 and the environmental health officers post-74 went off to create their own perfectly honed silos. In my view, these silos have contributed significantly to the system's failures in the intervening years, manifested by the dire toll of child protection scandals and a long list of environmental health disasters, from E. coli to BSE, from Legionella to hospital-acquired infection. In the case of environmental health, the independence that they acquired was usually short-lived, as without a well-connected sponsor, they became mopped up by ill-assorted conglomerate directorates. The health visitors and community nurses embarked on a nomadic trek through organisations and management arrangements from which they're yet to emerge. I'm reliably informed by former Manchester Chief Environmental Health Officer Mike Eastwood that when he began his training in the Public Health Department in Liverpool before 1974, under Liverpool's last Medical Officer of Health, Andrew Semple, the department consisted of over 5,000 staff. Not only those identified so far, but vets, food hygiene inspectors, chemical analysts, and many more, since scattered to the four winds to unaccountable quangos at national or regional levels, or privatised as with municipal water supplies. It's worth pointing out at this juncture that much of the public health resource which rested in local authorities at that time did not transfer to the NHS, along with the community physician, and that such resource that's to be found in public health departments today within the NHS has been fought for long and hard since 1974. So much for the history for now, but why does it matter? What's the purpose of a public health service in the 21st century, and how does it relate not only to the NHS and local government, but to the postmodern atomization of contemporary life and to what's left of civic society? How might we take the opportunity presented by the latest public health white paper, as well as other strong currents currently flowing, such as the talk of the big society, to get it right? The origins of the Victorian public health service are to be found firmly rooted in the social conditions which were prevalent in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. Conditions of squalor and poverty for the urban masses, which are well described by Engels in his book on the condition of the working class in England, published in 1845 and influenced by his travels around this area. And in the novels of Charles Dickens, a focus was given to growing political concerns and social restlessness by the publication of Edwin Chadwick's report on the sanitary condition of the labouring classes in 1842, which was a damning indictment of the living and working conditions of the working classes in industrial towns. The report focused on the sanitary idea, separation of human and animal waste from food and water, as an explanatory theory of ill health. a methodology for addressing it through sanitary reform, and a set of administrative arrangements for dealing with it based on a central board of health together with local boards to set proposals into effect. Take note of this architecture as it resonates with this afternoon's white paper. Chadwick's proposal that for the general means necessary to prevent disease, it would be good economy to appoint a district medical officer independent of private practice with the securities of special qualifications and responsibilities to initiate measures and reclaim the execution of the law. It was promptly picked up by Liverpool Town Council, which promoted its own Liverpool Sanatory Act, the Victorian spelling, sanatory, in 1846, which gave it the powers to appoint a local medical officer of health, which they did in 1847, with the appointment of William Henry Duncan, a local general practitioner who had a well-developed interest in public health. Not only had Duncan carried out his own survey of sanitary conditions in Liverpool and submitted evidence to Chadwick, who was writing his national report, but Duncan was also a founding member of the Liverpool branch of the Health of Towns Association, which was set up in 1843 to campaign for sanitary reform. The success of the Health of Towns Association on the national level led to the first Public Health Act appearing on the statute book in 1848, which provided, among other things, for the general appointment of local medical officers of health. This enabling approach meant that progressive councils were to follow Liverpool's lead, while others took as long as 20 years or more to catch up. Of particular interest, in view of the current proposals for the NHS to have a National Commissioning Board for Health Services, as well as the establishment of a cross-government public health committee and a Department of Health-based Public Health for England public health service, were the arrangements for the establishment of a central board of health, which would exercise some control over the local boards, which would be set up on a petition of 1/10 of the ratepayers, or could be imposed on local authorities if the crude death rate exceeded 23 per thousand population. Once set up, the boards were subject to certain compulsory provisions in the Act, including the appointment of a surveyor and inspector of nuisances to procure an ordnance survey, make sewers, require owners and occupiers to provide house drains, cleanse the streets, remove rubbish, register slaughterhouses and lodging houses, and provide sufficient water, as well as being permitted by the Act to pursue other permissive functions. Writing about this in 1999, in my Chadwick lecture given in Manchester, I speculated on the possibility of health action zones, of which Salford was a part, evolving into boards of health. Sadly, the health action zones were very short-lived and were soon replaced by other initiatives. Although I'm well aware of the legacy of the Salford, Manchester and Trafford Health Action Zone in terms of the strength of local partnership working in this area. We might now be moved to speculate about the opportunities to be posed by the boards of health and well-being, which are described again this afternoon, and as to what permissive powers they might acquire. In this way, we can see the beginnings of a system grounded in local democracy, which served the country well from 1848 to 1974, during which time the efforts to improve public health moved on successively from the sanitary or environmental to those of hygiene and personal behaviour, to the increasing provision of population-based health and social care, as this began to offer the prospect of making a difference. In this sense, the three pillars of public health, the biological, the environmental, and the social, are manifest in the movements and interactions of the institutional tectonic plates and responses. Throughout this whole story, however, lies the link between poverty and ill health. The links between poverty and ill health are by now well known and rehearsed, almost to the point at which they're no longer heard. The British tradition in this area, from Charles Booth in London and Rowntree in York to Townsend, Black, Morris, and now a new generation represented by Marmot, Wilkinson, and locally by Margaret Whitehead, has been very influential. and has periodically raised the profile of the issue politically and more widely internationally as well as locally, and has played into global issues of health and development. Our understanding of the links between poverty and ill health has progressed in steps that have taken us from an appreciation of where poverty fits into the life cycle, child poverty, poverty of large working class families, a matter recently thrown into the spotlight by politicians, and the poverty of the disabled, infirm, mentally ill and aged, to one where Wilkinson and Pickett have shown quite convincingly that at a population level within societies, states and countries where there are the biggest differences in income are also where there are to be found the biggest differences in health, notwithstanding average income levels. For example, the United States, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, but which has huge differences in income levels, also has huge differences in life expectancy. Today's public health white paper reinforces the importance of a life cycle approach to protecting and improving public health. Going beyond the descriptions, the problem of poverty can seem insuperable. Despite massive increases in public expenditure over the past 13 years, and despite some impact on child poverty, inequalities in health can seem stubbornly resistant to change, and we're uncomfortably reminded of Jesus' comments in Matthew 26, verse 11, that the poor you will always have with you. Yet, does it have to be like this? And how might we make an impact through policy and action at a societal and personal and local level, through the organised efforts of society? Some clues may be found in Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett's recent book, The Spirit Level, which identifies some places and times where real increases in equality have occurred, such as Bismarck's social insurance scheme in 19th century Germany, and Britain during both the First and Second World Wars, when social solidarity was taken as a prerequisite for military success. Quoting Richard Titmuss, Wilkinson reminds us that if the cooperation of the masses was thought to be essential to the war effort, then inequalities had to be reduced and the pyramid of social stratification had to be flattened. And in preparing this lecture over the last few months, I was reminded of this poster that some of you will have seen from the Museum of Labour History down the road. If Wilkinson reminds us that relative poverty is as relevant in its own way as absolute poverty, Titmuss took us onto a different plane altogether when it came to poverty itself, by teasing out what it is about money as a resource for everyday life that makes a difference. Money, like God, only means something if people believe in it. Otherwise, it's just paper or metal pieces. What money can do is give access to those other resources which impact on health and well-being. And for Titmuss, a narrow focus on money could be misleading. On the one hand, some money may be necessary but not sufficient for a healthy life, whilst on the other, as homeless people in Manhattan have long since discovered, it's possible to have a better standard of living as a homeless person in some parts of New York than in others. For Titmuss, control over resources through time was the real issue. Access to good parenting, choose your parents wisely, a safe and nurturing environment, educational, cultural, and work opportunities, not what you know, but who you know or where you live, recreation, a sense of worth, a secure home base. The recent floods have had a devastating effect on some people's health, irrespective of income level. Security in old age. Oh yes, and access to good preventive treatment and care services when needed. These were the real resources that led to common wealth, economic success, and a society at ease with itself. This understanding was captured by Beveridge in 1942 with his 5 giants: want, ignorance, idleness, squalor, and disease, which pointed to the 5 pillars of the welfare state. It's important to remind ourselves, now in the midst of a recession, which is every bit as challenging as that in the 20s and 30s, that coming out of the recession and the carnage of the Second World War, the vision of a welfare state more or less enjoyed a political consensus for 30 years. Solidarity and well-being are the companions of honour. What we now know is that a focus on the what without the how, without addressing people's need to be engaged and in the driving seat, can lead to enormous waste and counterproductive initiatives, usually carried out with the best of intentions. Remember slum clearance and high-rise flats, the ill-fated streets in the sky, here in Salford, as in Liverpool and elsewhere in the north, or the recent NHS investment, which has largely disappeared into hospitals and salaries rather than public health, prevention, or primary and community care. Such interventions are often vulnerable to the accusation of paternalism, nannying and the like, of wanting to do things to or fix people, whether or not they wish to be fixed by somebody else. So what is it that makes a difference? The backcloth of inequality remains, but it's time for the conversation to move on. We need to reframe the 5 giants for the 21st century and revisit Titmuss, Chadwick, and some of those who've gone before and wrestled with underlying issues whose essence is as relevant today as it was over 100 years ago. Some consensus is beginning to emerge about the policies and priorities which would make a difference to health and well-being equity. For example, the Marmot Review concluded that reducing health inequalities will require action on 6 policy objectives: giving every child the best start in life, enabling all children, young people and adults to maximize their capabilities and have control over their lives, create fair employment and good work for all, ensure healthy standard of living for all, and create and develop healthy and sustainable places and communities, and finally, strengthen the role and impact of ill health prevention. So far, so good. But in a sense, these conclusions still seem to be at a high level of abstraction, and to some would appear to be statements akin to motherhood and apple pie. Nevertheless, the mood music is welcome, and some of it is reflected in today's white paper. A reading of the literature already referred to, from Chadwick to Dickens and Rowntree to Titmuss, Townsend, Sir Douglas Black, the late Jerry Morris, Brian Abel Smith, would also indicate that current commentators are on a well-trodden path. Some clear policy objectives and campaigns are emerging. For example, the achievement of a minimum wage is now leading to moves towards a livable wage. A recognition that we must do something to achieve universal excellence in education so that all our children have opportunity and fulfilling work, not so that we can be ready for war with Germany, but so that we can compete economically on a global scale. That respect for the environment that nourishes and protects us must be taken much more seriously if we're not to threaten the well-being of future generations. That services that make a difference, whether they be preventive medicine, health protection, health improvement, or health and social care, need to be of a universally high standard if we're to avoid the burden of unnecessary ill health and expensive hospital care and optimize productivity and well-being of the whole population. But the new kid on the block is that of ownership and locus of control. People having the opportunity to be in the driving seat of their own and each other's destiny rather than having things done to them from on high. Paternalism is no longer fit enough or fit for purpose. For the coalition government, this has led to talk of the big society and a renewed focus on active citizenship. But what does this mean for those of us who see society through a public health prism? I'd like to take a few minutes to refer back again to the Victorian public health system and movement, and to draw out some lessons for how we respond to today's white paper proposals. As we've already seen, the Victorian arrangements grew out of the massive social upheaval that accompanied the agricultural and industrial revolutions, the disruption of a rural parish system, and threats from microorganisms thriving in squalor. The tension between prevention and treatment, which goes back to Greek times, was played out again as a battle for control of public health between different interest groups in the public and private sectors. During their time, mechanical solutions in the form of engineering, town planning, and bureaucratic programs, in the best sense of the phrase, provided real benefits. Ultimately, however, the system fragmented in the face of changing challenges and circumstances, and in the face of rival professional and institutional ambitions. The increasing domination of medical institutions by the influence of the pharmaceutical industry and a failure to adapt the preventive paradigm to the new challenges. Today's challenges in a new era of austerity are in their own way as great. The demographics alone are potentially frightening. Couple this with reduced resources and increased demands, and we're going to need all our ingenuity to get through. Margaret Mead was one of the first to point out that history is not pendular, but helical. The time dimension returns you to new circumstances. As we contemplate the revival of a local authority responsibility for part of the public health function, it's important that we don't replace one set of dysfunctional arrangements with another. Lessons from the past that should carry over for tomorrow should include that of the power of the local level to galvanize citizens when given its head within an enabling framework, and the potency of civic pride as well as the mutual benefit to be derived from enlightened self-interest. To this, we might add the importance of not allowing a fragmentation of the organized efforts of society when faced with challenges to public health, which might be biological, environmental, or social. All three need to be in concert for effective action. I would suggest that we're on a journey whose destination is still unclear. The big society debate is with us to stay. In the end, this is likely to boil down to whether, within a slimmer public sector, the momentum comes to be with rolling back the state, American Tea Party style, or reforming it so that paternalism is finally buried and replaced by a model based on enabling, coaching, and supporting co-production, active citizenship, and patients being their own experts, while supported by the technical knowledge of professionals and by the wonders of modern IT. In the end, we need to transform all of these ideas and ways of thinking into delivery systems which are fit for purpose to deliver shared goals. Implicit in this talk so far has been an iteration and a tension between structure and function. This tension has been ever present over the last few months in the meetings I've been attending relating to today's Public Health White Paper. One of the immense problems of the NHS, especially since 1974, has been its obsession with structures and changing them. Yet in many fields of knowledge and endeavour, from biology to architecture, it's recognised that the best outcomes are when structure follows function rather than determining it. Today's white paper takes cognizance of work by WHO, which describes 9 essential public health functions. I'll just list those to have them in mind. Prevention and surveillance and control of communicable and non-communicable disease, monitoring of the health situation, health promotion, occupational health, environmental protection, legislation and regulation, management in public health, specific public health services, and healthcare for vulnerable groups and high-risk populations. More simply, it's possible to describe the work of public health as falling within 4 domains which are underpinned by the lifeblood of public health: intelligence, research and development, educational support, and specific technical expertise. These 4 domains I would describe as health protection, health improvement, preventive medicine, and a population approach to health and social care. The domains described in the white paper this afternoon are slightly different from that. As we digest today's publication and set it alongside its two predecessors, the focus will inevitably move to the emerging structures of the new NHS and local authorities. In 1948, we were given a tripartite structure with hospital boards, community health services, including general practice, and finally, the third arm of that tripartite structure were the public health departments in local authorities. Contrary to many people's understanding, these three elements taken together constituted the NHS. Today, what we see is a kind of born-again tripartite structure, this time with local primary care consortia, which in time may become British versions of North American health maintenance organisations, with the important difference that they will have a whole population remit and be in a position to run local public health programmes and address the biological strand of public health. The second component will take the form of the public health units in top-tier local authorities working across local government to re-engage with functions such as housing, environmental health, recreation and education, culture and the arts, which have largely been divorced from the NHS for much of the past 36 years. And this will lead on the social dimension of health improvement. The third component, in the semaphore position as I describe it, which is like this, accounting directly to the Secretary of State in London for some functions, but across to the local authority for others, the health protection aspects for immunisation, vaccination, screening, and health emergency planning. The keystone of the whole system, however, will be the local Board of Health and Wellbeing. Remember Edwin Chadwick. Focused on the local joint strategic needs assessment and guided by the local Director of Public Health in concert with local strategic partners from various agencies, the Board of Health and Wellbeing will strategically stitch together NHS commissioning with that of local government and an increasing array of providers from the business and social enterprise outwardly facing to local communities and citizens, growing the civic space. I believe that there are three evidence-based systems which can already be deployed to deliver the new public health, drawing on the work of John McKnight and asset-based community development from Chicago, total place approaches to health promotion and health improvement, such as healthy cities, towns, villages, workplaces, schools and prisons, as developed in conjunction with the World Health Organization, and last but not least, a public health approach to primary care as developed in South Africa and Jerusalem by Sidney Kark, Leon Epstein and colleagues, and here in the UK by Will Pickles, Julian Tudor-Hart, King's Fund, and more recently by my GP colleagues in Cumbria. There's a lot to do and a huge amount of development ahead. It's very exciting. Welcome to the challenge and the experiment. It remains to be seen whether Secretary of State Andrew Lansley will be proved correct.
Hi, it's Mohammed Said from Finance. My interest in public health stems from my position as a non-executive on the local PCT board. And so the question I'm going to ask you, in terms of public health function moving, if you like, back to the local authority after 40, is it a good thing? And how will it affect the patients and the public in terms of engagement? And what new will be done that will improve, you know, the life expectancy and the health and well-being outcomes in this new arrangement? Thank you.
So there's two questions there. I mean, in short, I think it is a good thing. I think this afternoon's public health white paper I would describe as being a glass at least 3/4 full, because I think there's much more opportunity to influence the conditions of everyday life if public health is rooted in local authorities than if it's rooted in the health service. So it must be a good thing. But I think what I was trying to say in the talk was that it would be as big a mistake if public health was only rooted in local government as it's been for the last 36 years, really being rooted in the health service. Partly because I think local authorities have become fixated on personal services and have long since forgotten the bigger role of mobilizing communities and providing community leadership. The fixation of local government has tended to be on the things that they provide on a person-to-person basis, rather like the way the health service is obsessed with the way it's providing services on a person-to-person basis, rather than influencing the determinants. And because the three strands of public health are social, environmental, and biological, you have to act on all three domains. I think the opportunity is going to lie with how the local Board of Health and Wellbeing brings together people who are involved in all these domains and provides a framework based on the Joint Strategic Needs Assessment to influence all of that. So I think the potential is all there. I think concern has been expressed over the last few months while this paper has been being drafted at the loss of input into the health service from public health, because there has been a shift and a development in recent years. And in my own experience in Cumbria is that the family doctors there have become very motivated by public health, and they're very up for it, and they are wanting to commit quite a lot of their own budgets now into prevention and public health measures. So we don't want to lose that. And that's addressed in the white paper this afternoon. I think what we're going to see is that there will be general practitioner representation or other folk in primary care. It's not just about doctors on the health and well-being boards. And what we're going to see, certainly I've secured this in Cumbria, is that there'll be public health representation on the local commissioning boards, so that there'll be a cross-stitching to secure that. Yeah.
Okay. Just a final comment. I think, for my money, it's a good certain aspects in terms of the joint community need assessment that the local authority does. So hopefully the serves public health can be moulded in line with the needs of the population. Where I think for me the risk is, at least in my patch, we're seeing a slow engagement, clinical engagement, with the GP consortia. And also I think public might be getting put off, and there might be some reinvention of the wheel in terms of the engagement that you need with the public. I think that's...
Well, you can overstate this issue about clinical leadership, but it is important. I mean, all I can say to you is, as a rule of thumb, I would go along with what the previous chief medical officer held from my own experience as regional medical officer, that maybe 5 or 10% of clinicians shouldn't actually be working as clinicians, for one reason or another. I think maybe about 30% of general practitioners are really potentially willing to take on leadership roles. And that leaves about 60% who, for whatever reason, tend to become jaundiced by the daily round and the routine, and really need to be kept motivated. And I think, actually, that what you see when you've got family doctors becoming interested in thinking about the whole population and in the prevention side is that the motivation is phenomenal. I mean, we've got very highly motivated GPs in Cumbria. And so I think that's one way to energize, that other group. But I think what needs to happen around the country is that talent spotting needs to take place. And what we did 4 years ago in Cumbria was find the GPs who really wanted to get stuck in. That's what we did. And it's really been fantastic to do that. And I think a lot of places haven't really done that, so they need to do that, and they need to do that with some urgency. The other thing I'd say is that when you go through these reorganizations, you lose your way for 2 to 3 years. there's blight for 2 to 3 years. It's a ridiculous situation. So it's very important to do this kind of work that I try to do, which is to paint the vision of where we're headed, to get people back on track as quickly as possible, and to shape it. Because the honeymoon period, you know, normally in any new situation, whether it's a marriage or whether it's an organizational new job, 18 months and then things start to bed down. What's really important is to make sure that you get things on track during that 18 months period, that you put in place the things that are really going to make a difference in terms of leadership, in terms of the infrastructure which needs to support that vision. And you know, we've committed a lot of resource to intelligence. I mean, I was just signing off at the moment. We've commissioned a set of life cycle reports that are now ready to go to the printer for Cumbria. So we've got Born in Cumbria, Starting Shore in Cumbria, Coming of Age in Cumbria, Living Well in Cumbria, and the later part of life in Cumbria. We've got a set of documents which will all be there to inform this. They'll all be published and out in the new year. So I think getting the intelligence to shape what people are doing is important too.
I think it's been a really interesting talk about, in lots of ways, your argument appears to me to be the extent to which under current conditions we can reinvent a kind of social democratic, a localist model, a mutual model and so on, which rests on the premise about a language of citizenship, about public health and so on. It seems to me there's an alternative discourse, an alternative set of practices in here which are about the relationship between people defined as consumers or customers whose needs will be provided by private providers organised and managed through GP consortia, which is a different set of languages and a different way of looking at a set of social relationships than the reinvention of a kind of mutual social democratic. And that seems to me to be the different potential polarities of what's happening in the coalition and as its contradictory politics play out. So I wonder if you could, I'm very interested that you've used the term citizenship. You've looked at GPs as interested in that kind of public health domain. But what about that whole other nexus of relationships which says people are customers or consumers whose needs will be satisfied through a managed service that will be a privately managed, privately delivered set of services?
I agree with you. I think you put your finger on what is going to be the real debate over the next 10 years or so. Really, I think you're right. But I think in moving away from, if you read that little booklet I put out, I mean that was a lecture I gave about 10 years ago in Liverpool. But it's really talking about we've gone from feudal to paternalistic to industrial stuff, but we're struggling to find something else. We still were in a paternalistic mode. I mean, Mrs. Thatcher took us lurching into free market stuff, and we're still struggling to find a different form, which is a mature society where there's participation and where people can realise their talents and give them and contribute them and not be emasculated. I mean, George Bernard Shaw said all professions are conspiracies against the laity. I mean, the relationship that we need to have between when you're a patient and when you're a doctor needs to be co-production. It needs to be different from that which we've all been familiar with, where the doctor's the one with the knowledge and all the rest of it, and you go along there and you get told, so that negotiation to a different form. The pure commercial thing, you have to remember where that came from. I mean, I sort of realised something was going on in the 70s, really, because I used to talk about, when I was growing up in Liverpool, if you lived in a council house, you could have any colour front door as long as it was green, and you weren't allowed to keep dogs and cats. And the people who lived in council houses got fed up with being stigmatised by the council housing, even though it was actually good quality housing because they felt that they were being treated differently from if you had your own house. And that's what Mrs. Thatcher put her finger on when she really started opening up the thing about choice. I had a slide I used to use teaching the medical students that was from Fords at Halewood, because the entry-level Ford Fiesta, the cheapest Ford you could buy from Halewood, you had a choice of 16 colours. You know, the cheapest Ford you could buy. I mean, people were saying they wanted, you know, choice, but they weren't being given choice with public services. And the Conservatives got hold of that. And, I mean, in the health sphere, I discovered when I was working in Southampton that women who, the Pakistani wives were getting, there were issues about the healthcare in Southampton. And it was only when we realized that basically, you know, they wouldn't come to see a doctor without their husband, but the clinics weren't open at the times their husbands could come, because they were mainly working on the buses in Southampton, and they'd lose a whole shift's pay if they came with their wife to the gynae outpatients, the obstetric outpatients, because the service was being organised for the benefit of the consultants and the hospital, not for the benefit of, so it's about variety and niche provision to suit different people's needs. And, you know, that discourse wasn't addressed until too late, really. I mean, you know, so I think you're right. I think the point you make is absolutely right. I think, you know, we are blessed in Cumbria because we've got GPs who want to set up social enterprises. They don't want to run away and make loads of money. And I think you know, the argument needs to be played out about how you frame the accountability.
Thank John on all of our behalves. I know it's been a very interesting and stimulating evening. I'm sure all of us are going to go away with quite a bit to think about, probably quite a lot of challenges as to how we can be those opportunists and strategic people who actually get involved in our local community in terms of health, and it's good to think about that. So thank you for that. And noting that this was the third white paper in several years, we look forward to you coming back and recounting what has been going on when we get to the fourth one.
Oh God, I hope not.
So, finally, and thank you very much.